welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you today?
Good. How about yourself?
Can't complain, it's the weekend, so all good things, all relaxing. The weather's nice, so all good here. Um, for those listening, why don't you do a quick intro, like who you are, what you do, and then we'll just hop into the rest of it. Like you mentioned 2 minutes ago, you can talk about this stuff for hours, so I'm sure it'll be a fruitful conversation, and this is a subject that I don't know too much about, so excited to learn more for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ryan Sullivan. Currently I am working at the U.S. Department of State. Under the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, we have an Office of Transportation Policy. I kind of work on maritime transportation and trade writ large, and have a small team that I work with that does a lot when maritime transportation intersects with foreign policy. Prior to starting with Department of State, I used to work out at sea. So I was working on the ships, doing the job, specifically as a navigator. I'm a licensed second mate, is what we call it. So it's like a structure of like, third mate's bottom tier, licensed officer up to second mate, chief mate, and then you have the captain, captain running the entire ship. And then you have a whole engineering department that has a very similar structure. But yeah, I used to sail out as a third mate on military Sea Lift Command vessels, and they work a niche part of our market where we replenish the U.S. Navy overseas so that they can maintain operations, with forward presence. So I've done tankers, I've done ammo ships, even some special mission ships where we work with the U.S. Navy on board a U.S. warship. And that all started when, right out of high school, I was applying to federal service academies. We all know Navy, we know Army, Air Force, even some might know Coast Guard Academy, but little and few know about the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, which is based in Kings Point, New York. It is unlike the other service academies, which are funded by DoD or DHS. This one's funded by DOT. And so we are trained and educated to license merchant mariners. Some of my classmates have gone into active duty military. One of the cool perks of the school is you can choose any branch, Air Force, Coast Guard, Army, and go into that right after school. But I chose to get my license and make sailing a career, and yeah.
Very nice. So the question from the last guest is speaking of captains and leadership and stuff, said, when have you felt most vulnerable in a public setting or leadership role, and how did you navigate that experience?
Oof, that's a good one. Um, I'd have to say that I've been in not too public of roles with my time with State Department or whatnot, but having gone to a federal service academy, one of the key tenets is leadership, and so they really put you on the spot in most cases. Um, and I think one of my early lessons was when I was what we call like a company commander within the Merchant Marine Academy. And so it's kind of like an RA in a lot of ways, but they set it up like a military hierarchy. So, you have a bunch of seniors that do different staff jobs. Like one might do logistics for the building, and one might just kind of maintain, the presence on a specific floor. But I was in charge of the whole building, and I was I took it very seriously, whereas some didn't take it as seriously, and so having that different dynamic made it hard because there's a structure above you, there's a structure below you, and you have to work with both sides, balancing sometimes the rigid rules that are in place, but also having that human element where people are going to make very different decisions that aren't by the book per se. So balancing that off, and that led to a lot of my leadership development, going on to ships, where you have a different cast of characters with a lot of different backgrounds, and then now where I'm at today, I'm in the middle of a bureaucracy. I would not put myself high on a totem pole, but I'm also not, super low. So, it's always good to have to be humble in every position you're at. And I think that's a key I take away.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Okay, so when you hear, or like when people hear maritime or they hear trade, right? There's been lots of talk about tariffs and trade and all these things, and everyone and their mom now has an opinion on trading policy. Um, where, I guess if you want to define trade, and specifically from the maritime perspective, like, can you give people listening kind of an idea of what when they hear these terms, like what they actually mean? Like, because somebody might hear it and go, okay, well, yeah, it's just a cargo ship with some containers and it's going from place to place. But like, really, when you hear like trade network and all these things, it's much more complicated, I would guess, than that. So, if you could give maybe like some some of the so some that those terms in particular, but also other terms that we might use throughout the episode, just to give people some context into the conversation and like define some of the terms up front.
Absolutely. So, first off, I want to put a stat out there, and it's really going to highlight, where maritime fits into the conversation on trade. 80% of trade is conducted in maritime transportation by volume. And so whenever you're getting your sneakers from Nike coming from overseas, they're likely coming over in a container. We do have air transportation as well. They have a niche market in high value goods, so usually smaller or high value goods. So by value, I'm going to butcher this number, but I think it's close to 60% by value moves by plane, leaving, the rest of the percentages to shipping. But, shipping improves scale when it comes to trade. So that's why, when you're watching CNN or something, whenever there's discussion on trade, they're going to have like a container ship in port in the background as the scenery, because it's not as cool having, people sitting in the office, either making purchases for a company, or bureaucrats talking about trade policy.
Yeah. So when somebody says like trade route, what do they mean? Because again, like in my head, it's just like, well, you have a big ship and you sail from that point and you go across the ocean to that point. But then you hear something like, well, the Houthis are attacking this trade route, and you're like, well, what? Why just go somewhere else? And of
Yeah.
course, for the Red Sea, of course, is a little bit different because you've got various waterways where you can only get certain places from that area. But like global trade routes, like what does that mean to uh the normal person that doesn't live and breathe this?
Yeah. So I think, you're correct. Trade routes are very complex, and it's really not an A to B type trade. If I were to give you a visual, think of like the human body and our like cardiovascular system, where you have a heart which pumps blood. It goes through arteries, then goes down to veins. We have major arteries in our supply chain, which usually is going to come from a manufacturing hub. And today that's going to be mainly out of China, even a little bit out of Southeast Asia. And the major consumer markets are going to be the United States and Europe. And, everyone's a consumer in their own way, but by volume, the United States and Europe lead in that. So when we're talking about container shipping, which is a big segment of the market, um, their arteries are going to be from China through the Malacca Strait by Singapore, going typically to the Red Sea, up through the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean, and then from there going out of the Straits of Gibraltar, either to Western Europe, to ports like Rotterdam, or heading straight to the United States. But for the most part, those arteries are interconnected because there's a port stop along the way, where you're actively trading and sometimes what we call transshipping. So maybe dropping a container off in, say, Karachi, Pakistan, um, where it will be put on another ship that provides feeder service, which essentially takes it to its end destination, where these big container lines are going to have access because they only operate on those arteries. Now, for container shipping companies, that's where they make the most money. They have such a large scale on those vessels, and they have essentially a conga line of ships or a conveyor belt moving along there. So you have essentially one ship stopping in each of the ports on that artery once a week, and maybe transloading or just dropping off for end destination use. But supply chains also, you have a manufacturing hub, but raw goods need to get to that manufacturing hub to create what would be a final product. So sometimes we'll see raw goods come from South America, go to Asia to be reassembled or made into intermediate parts or sometimes final parts and go to their end destination, such as the United States. But that's truly just looking at container shipping. There's also tankers who operate very different uh, model of supply chains because then we're talking about where is oil extracted. So
Hmm.
your crude oil is going to come from uh, the Arabian Gulf. It can come from Russia, United States, Venezuela, or whatnot, and then it needs to be processed. And there's certain markets that have niches in that. The Gulf of America, we have a lot of, you know, in Texas and Louisiana, we have a lot of processing where we can make refined oil products and send it out to final destination markets such as Europe. And then there's LNG, which is a whole another niche in
Is it
itself.
is it actually called Gulf of America now? You're the first person I've heard use that, not as a joke.
Well, I'm a bureaucrat. The direction we're given is it's Gulf of America now, and there's, that, yeah, it is Gulf of America
Okay,
for
I
the
won't. I
United
won't.
States government.
I won't make you dig the hole anymore. That's funny to me.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, keep going. Okay, so LNG.
LNG, you can't put that on a typical tanker. They have
Hmm.
their own types of vessels, which are niche because they have to pressurize the gas and liquefy it and and so we have this is a really interesting fact. We're a leading exporter of LNG, yet we have no LNG ships in the U.S. fleet. We actually rely on overseas uh, countries and companies to move our LNG, which
Hmm.
is a little bit surprising. And
Yeah.
I
Well,
can definitely dig in on the dynamics of our national shipping because it's an interesting conversation in itself. But
yeah.
to kind of close out supply chains, yeah, they are dynamic. It's not always a to B kind of situation, and another thing too is they're quite resilient. We might see shocks to the system, but companies shift supply chains rapidly and respond to
Okay, so I have a couple thoughts on that. The first is that um, when that bridge collapsed in Baltimore,
it.
I thought I don't remember. I'm not gonna say the number because I don't remember, but it was like, oh, some percentage of shipping goes through Baltimore. It's gonna be a big issue, yada yada yada. Firstly, what do you make of that? Because in terms of the situation itself, because it looked strange. I
Mhm.
don't, again, I don't know anything about it in terms of I don't know how shipping works in that way, but it seemed odd how it occurred. But then secondly, when you mentioned that companies are resilient and they move things around, so what sort of damage does that actually cause? Um, like I guess both short term and long term in terms of like affecting the consumer or like that sort of thing.
Yeah. There you highlighted the Baltimore Bridge case. There's also the Ever Given. Do you remember that? In the Suez Canal where it blocked the Suez Canal
Oh,
with
that was a
oil.
couple years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was a
Yeah, yeah,
couple
yeah.
years ago. That one might say that was, you know, was also a supply chain disruption. And Black Sea has been quite a supply chain disruption for food
Yeah.
goods. But yeah, I mean, take Baltimore, for example. Yeah, there's a market that relies on exporting out of Baltimore, especially like our coal and some of our natural resources. But we also import a lot of vehicles through Baltimore. So um, we there was obviously an effect at the beginning, but going back to the point I was making about resilience, companies will say, okay, Baltimore's out of the game now. What's the nearest port we can move to? And while it does disrupt it, because then you're relying on, say, like truckers or train networks that take this product to an end destination, they make it work. It's going to have some short-term effects and costs, but in the long term, it's kind of like you get this huge spike in disruption and additional costs, and then it starts coming back down. And if another disruption were to happen, that's you'll have another spike, but it won't be as high in that localized area. And the reason being is these companies have already felt a shock before, and they're like, okay, we've done this before. So how are we going to make this work? And talking about broader trade policy, the first time under President Trump 1.0 in 2018 is when our trade war started. And we saw that huge spike then of disruptions to the supply chain because nobody's done anything like it. And then over time, companies started working with it. Through the Biden administration, they didn't change any of the trade policies that Trump put into place. They just kept it, streamlined. But when President Trump was reelected in 2024, um, yeah, there was concern about trade, and we've now seen a lot of trade action, reciprocal tariffs and whatnot. But um, I would argue that bump was not as huge as the 2018 bump to disruption. Now, it wasn't as expected because you saw just this huge package of reciprocal trade tariffs going out. And so I think that elevated the stakes in a lot of ways where it wasn't as minimal of a bump as I was kind of describing before. It ended up, taking its own course. But it, I think we're seeing a movement into new trade policy for the United States, and everybody's going to eventually understand that.
You don't want to comment on the weirdness of the Baltimore thing? I don't, I won't make you, but
Oh no, I'm fine with it. You mean like the vessel itself just
yeah, it was super strange. Like the video was super weird. Like the lights went off a little bit, and then it was like, really, they didn't turn, but then they did turn, and then it was like they turned
yeah,
into the thing.
yeah. So when you're on a ship, um, you rely on a power plant on board. This vessel in particular had already been flagged numerous times in various ports for its issues with its power plant. And like a house, like a building, like anything, you have a power plant and then you have electricity going throughout it. And sometimes there can be disturbances in electrical lines and stuff. And unfortunately, to some of the more important aspects of it. So that could be literally the power on your ship, it could be the rudder or whatnot. What they experienced was there was some kind of disruption to the electricity being, and power generated in their power plant, and it turned everything off. And at that point, when you're on the bridge doing the navigation, in a point that's so critical, like going under a bridge where you can potentially hit something, that's the worst time it can happen. And so this there was nothing they could do because they had no backup source of power that was going to help them maneuver. And so they were essentially left drifting into a bridge.
Mm.
So
I don't think, at least from the like hot takes that I saw, I don't think people were blaming the crew as so much some sort of like EMP type thing that knocked it out. which was getting into the weird part about this and that and whatever.
Yeah, I don't have my aluminum foil to,
Yeah.
pat on, but I would definitely argue it was not an EMP
Yeah,
thing.
or some other kind of whatever. It's like sometimes I like to put the aluminum hat on. It
Yeah, yeah, I
makes
get
things
it.
fun. Okay, so when you say trade war, that's another term that I think is thrown around a lot that people hear and they don't actually understand what it means. And I am one of those people that doesn't understand what it means. So can you expand on that a little bit as well? Because we hear the term trade deficit and they were like, well, we need to increase tariffs to like make up the trade deficit, but it's like, well, the deficit inherently is not a bad thing, right? The example that sometimes is used is like, I have a trade deficit with the grocery store,
Yeah.
and that's totally fine. So, like, what does a trade war actually entail, and what does it mean, and what sorts of tactics are like? Is there a like the Sun Tzu's art of trade war? Is that a thing?
So I'll caveat first with saying that I'm not necessarily a trade policy guy, but obviously a lot of the work I do revolves around trade
Yeah,
policy. And so that being said, the a trade war is essentially like any kind of war where it might be bilateral, it might be multilateral, where you're increasing the cost for other countries to trade with you, and that could be through tariffs. And that's what we're seeing is President Trump is increasing tariffs on other countries because in reality they already have tariffs that exist against U.S. goods coming into their markets. So he's basically saying like, okay, this can't be the status quo. If you're going to put a tariff on our country's goods, we're going to put a reciprocal tariff on you. And I think for the longest time, the United States has been preaching, you know, having low trade barriers and globalization in the markets. And it's been recorded for decades that Trump, even before he was president, was saying that we have an unfair deal, and one might be able to point to the fact that we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs and other indicators showing that our businesses are suffering as a result of various trade policies overseas.
yeah. When you say it like that, and I remember what you were saying about Trump's been saying stuff about tariffs and all that stuff for like years and years and years, like decades. But how is this allowed to be the status quo? This is the part that I don't understand, right? Like when I had a couple economy guys come on to talk about the tariffs, and it's like tariffs inherently don't seem like a great thing, right? Because you're putting a disincentive, like a tax to me is a disincentive on trade, which is a good, to me, it's a good thing, right? If one company or one country does something better than another one, and then the other country does something else better, you trade and you get the highest quality of both of those, whatever those things are. So you would like you're putting a disincentive on it. Then from a national security perspective or from like a sovereignty perspective, maybe you want to do one of those things or whatever. It's like, okay, well then if you're arguing if tariffs are good, why don't you have 500% tariffs on everyone for everything? It's like, well, that doesn't make sense either. So how I don't understand how this was allowed to be the status quo for so long, where other countries are tariffing things that we're producing and we are not. Like, I don't like that's the part that to me makes no sense because now it's like, oh, some people are running around saying Trump's a nut job because he's doing all these tariffs. And then it's like, well, they were doing it to us. But it's like, how is this allowed to be the status quo for so long? That's the part that like I don't hear people talking about that much is like how this was allowed to happen for so long without
Yeah,
repercussion or whatever. And of course, there's lots of other things that go into that, like subsidizing NATO defenses and all these other things, right? That goes on and it helps our defense contractors that they have to buy weapons from.
yeah.
But like, and from the trade perspective, especially from the maritime perspective, from a like a volume, like you mentioned, how is this allowed to occur? Like I don't get it.
Yeah, so I would say that there was a tipping point in 2016 where we said this is not the status quo we want to have anymore because when trade policies go into effect, there's no immediate effect. It happens over time. So for decades, from I wouldn't give you a specific time period, but we see more manufacturing plants close down in the United States, especially in like the heartland or Pennsylvania or whatnot, and basically there's this class of people losing opportunities as a result, and I think that hit a fever pitch in 2016, where the people are saying like, hey, we got shut out of the economy. But there's a whole nother class of people that, usually reside on the coastlines and larger cities where they have white collar jobs and everything's fine because we do have a comparative advantage in innovation, technology, financial institutions. So there's people that benefit from all of this. But there's also a subset of America that doesn't. So that's just kind of talking about the societal reasons for
Yeah.
why we've kind of gone to that tipping point.
It seems very short-sighted. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's going great for people on the coast, but also there's like a whole chunk of the country. Anyways, it's a
Yeah,
different
but
different discussion for a different day.
let's talk about the maritime industrial base because
Yeah.
I think you're on the precipice of a point I wanted to talk about in this
Yeah, yeah,
podcast.
go for it.
It
Go for it.
is the decline in US's maritime dominance. And that, I would say there's been multiple eras where the United States has been a leader in shipbuilding, for example. When we were a brand new burgeoning country, we had this strategic advantage of having all this lumber available to us. And we had a whaling industry in the Northeast. And so as a result, there was a lot of investment coming to the United States to build. We had the inputs to build ships. We created yards to do so, and there was a lot of money pouring into it because we could do it cheaper, we could do it better. Um, Over the 19th century, that kind of dissipated as we moved to steel and coal, and then petroleum for fueling and everything because we didn't have those inputs as readily available, or at least we couldn't do it cheaply enough. And we realized this in the early 20th century where we kind of lost our shipbuilding capacity. But we took advantage of like World War One and World War Two, where the Europeans, who were traditionally the shipbuilding nations and the owners of shipping companies, they were busy in war. And so the United States was like, in order to support the wars, we're like, well, we need ships because we live on this island. And in order to get what we need to bring to the front lines, we need ships to do so. And so we put a lot of actual government money into it. And our workforce was there was plenty of jobs available there. So they jumped into this field, and we were, if you look at the Liberty ships in World War II, I think they cranked out a Liberty ship in less than 48 hours. It was like a record at the time,
This is
and
a cargo ship?
um, yeah, cargo ships. So moving. They called it the three Bs. I think it was beans, bullets, and um, bombs. So that's what they were moving. They also were making tankers as well. But then after World War II, we had all these ships, and they were government ships. The government didn't need all these ships, and so we sold them to private companies. Tried to recoup some money off of it. And you had companies like Maersk who bought a ton of our Liberty ships to use in the private sector, and then a lot of U.S. companies as well. And ever since World War II, there's just been this decline in the shipping industry. And we had a lot of laws and policies on the books, such as a construction differential subsidy and operational differential subsidy that really kind of closed the gap between um, other countries that could do it a lot cheaper. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration went away with those subsidy programs. They still remain on the books, they just have not been funded. And as a result, today we I think in 2024, we only had two ocean-going vessels on order books, whereas China pumps out thousands of
You
ships a
said
year.
two on that were being built, or two?
Two that were ordered to be built.
We only had the U.S. government, or does that include private companies as well?
That's just looking at private companies. I'm not talking about like naval construction.
No, no, no.
Naval
Well, I meant,
construction,
but like not like shipping only two in all of the
only
U.S.
two. Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay, actually that brings up an interesting question because from naval as well, I don't know this guy who runs a company called, oh, let me look up. It's called Saronic, and I don't remember the guy's name.
Hmm.
Dino something. I don't know. He was on Sean Ryan's show the other day. Let
Okay.
me look. Oh, this is gonna bug me. But anyway, so he's talking about, let's see. No, that's not it. Oh, it's gonna bug me. Sean Ryan show. His name is, if only he didn't just post reels and
Yeah, right.
he posted the actual guy's name. Uh Dino Mavroukas.
Okay.
Anyways, so he founded this company basically building like drones but ships. So like unmanned ships. And he was talking about the same thing in terms of like the naval construction, which is, yeah, we retired. I think the number was like 12 and we only built 8 last year. So we're at net -4 for the entire Navy, and China built like in the hundreds or thousands or whatever. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, anyways, keep going. But I listened to that 3 days ago and I was like, oh, that'll be interesting to talk with Ryan
Yeah.
too.
No, our naval construction is actually has a leg up compared to the commercial sector because how the industry works is you want to have a steady flow of orders. The US government's always going to want to continue to build ships, but it comes at a very high cost as compared to like Korea, Japan, or China, who
Yeah.
have the scale to do it and the cheaper labor to do it.
Okay, so
Um,
we've only got 2 orders
uh-huh.
and China's got 1,000. So
Yeah.
what does this mean for, like, you had a note in the outline thing that you sent me about flags and ownership and stuff. So like we can still have something be shipped, but maybe it's not our ship that's on it, or like I guess how does that work? Because
Yeah.
like if you don't need it to be our US built ship and the stuff is still going from place to place or whatever, then because then you get into this weird, I'm just thinking out loud, right? I'm sure you probably have answers to all these things, but like if it's a US based company, let's say Nike, for instance, and they make their shoes in the Philippines or Vietnam or whatever, and they ship it on a ship that is a has a Japanese flag, and I get my shoes, I'm happy. Nike sold a pair of shoes. It got to me. They're happy. What's the that relationship dynamic situation like? Like what's the importance of, because it makes sense, right? Just on the face of it, like we should be built like the US should be building ships.
Right.
Gotcha. But I still got my shoes.
Still got your shoes, and you probably got them for a good deal.
Yeah,
Whereas if you put it on a US flagship, the price would be, very different.
right. So talk through that.
Yeah. So first off, I think you were looking at my note on ownership and flags, and this is where this it gets very complicated. So
We
first
got
off,
time. Be complicated.
yeah, yeah, I told you I can talk hours on this subject. But let's start off with container shipping, just with the example of shoes. There's 9 companies that really do the ocean carrying and container shipping. I believe it's like 4 or 5 are in Europe, and 4 or 5 are in Asia. But those are just the companies that own the fleets. So they pay the money to own these vessels. The vessels themselves have to be regulated under what we call a flag. So a flag of registry. and that comes from a UN International Maritime Organization structure, and that flag doesn't have to correspond with the ownership. So that flag could be, you know, it could be Singapore, for example. So you have a Chinese-based company, shipping company that owns the vessel. It's flagged in Singapore, and the cargo is, going to various destinations. And then you have the insurance companies also that play in the background, and those are usually based in London, for the most part. Um, so yeah, there's this disconnect, but what companies do is they prefer to flag their ship where it's the cheapest. And that means low regulation, low taxes. And some call them flags of convenience, some call them open registries. It's You'll see like Panama, Liberia, Republic of Marshall Islands are the three big ones, and they have just very low regulation and low taxes. So it just makes sense in the business scheme. So um, that gets to the structure of the various entities that are involved in all of this. But a company like Nike, they're going to have a whole supply chain department that is working on how do we get stuff from our factories in China over to America. And they're going to go sometimes through a third party, which is likely directly to the shipping companies. They do big contracts with like Hapag Lloyd, Maersk, Costco, and they say like we're going to reserve this much capacity on your ships for this next year at this price, kind of like futures and whatnot. And so if there's a supply chain disruption, companies like Nike, because they have so much scale, they're not going to be disrupted for the most part. So the Red Sea disruption, they're pretty good, for the most part. But it's the smaller companies, let's say, you know, a local store that relies on like hardware. Um, they're maybe moving, I don't know, 3, 4 containers a month or something like that, and they probably play the spot market, which is very different, where instead of having a contract that's set at a price, based on the dynamics, sometimes they can get some really low prices, but sometimes when you have a disruption, those prices are going to go up. And so it's always a gamble in a lot. But it's kind of like the stock market in ways where you have future markets and you have like, you know, playing around with stocks on a daily. So,
Gotcha. Okay, so the shipbuilding capacity, then based on what you just described, right? The using the example, the shoes example, or even the
yeah,
other ones, like the thing still shows up where it's supposed to show up.
right.
So the US shipbuilding capacity, what's the importance of that?
Yeah. So, for decades we've been beating a drum on the national security importance of it. So in wartime, we're going to need ships to move military cargoes, and we still need it today in relative peacetime. We need those supply chains to support our government and military operations overseas, and um, DOT has programs such as like the Maritime Security Program, and others to help move government and military cargoes. But if there were a war, we'd be in a very bad position because we have less than 100 ocean-going vessels in our U.S. flag fleet right now.
What?
What we
How is that even okay?
Yeah, we now what we did in some of the previous wars is we relied on allies and partners to bring capacity into the fold, because when a major war breaks out, supply chains are not going to be operating as normal. And so you're going to have a lot of ships just sitting there, not doing their normal trade patterns. And so it's probably going to get moved. Again, it goes back to the whole resilience thing. I think it all figures itself out. But, the US being one of the biggest military nations, if a major war were to break out, I have faith that a lot of that shipping capacity would move into a safer flag and whatnot. But for right now, yeah, we don't have a lot because it goes back to what I was talking about with removing subsidies, which are very important to the three major shipbuilders, which is China, Korea, and Japan, and our labor costs. They're just not competitive. So we're not building ships in peacetime to keep up with demand. And we have no law on the book requiring that a certain amount of imports and exports have to be put on US flag vessels. Because at the end of the day, that would add cost to you as the consumer.
Mm.
And we don't want to pay more. But would it be, do we shift our mindset and say, well, the strategic importance is for us to have a US flag fleet? Or do we say, well, no, it just makes more sense for the American people to get cheaper goods?
Yeah. Hmm.
Or the other argument is that we, um, move a lot of our manufacturing back to the US so we're less dependent on manufacturing countries like China.
I vote for that one.
Did you?
Um, so you mentioned the security piece. Piracy's been a thing for as long as anyone can remember.
You've seen Captain
Caribbean,
Phillips, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The Pirates of the Caribbean and like the British East India Trading Company. Then the Somali Wars in it was 1801 or 1803 or something like that with Thomas Jefferson,
It
where the
was
Europe
Barbary
or
Pirates.
Barbary pirates, yeah, and
Yeah.
then Somalia was later. Barbary pirates where the European countries were just paying them off, and Jefferson was like, "No, we don't do that in the U.S."
Yeah.
Even though
And
maybe
and and some
the
will
war probably cost more.
argue that the US Navy was created only to protect our merchant fleet.
Well, I mean,
So, I
probably
mean,
maybe.
they have a lot more mission now, but
Yeah, yeah. You
initially it
might say
was,
it's a little bit different now.
yeah, of course.
And then of course the Somali pirates now. So we've got this sort of situation, and of course the Houthis kind of bombing Israeli and U.S. shipping in the Red Sea. But what like in terms of protection, right? Because these are not naval vessels. Are there stipulations like under the Geneva Conventions or whatever, where like if you run if you're in a battle and you got the Red Cross on you, like you're not supposed to get shot at. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
But is there similar protections for merchant vessels? And this is where kind of you get into um, what was it like the Lusitania in World War One, where they're like, oh, it was a passenger ship, but also maybe it was carrying a bunch of weapons. Like, okay, well, you're gonna blur the lines there. That might not go so well for you. But like, so from a merchant perspective, how do you guys you as in that industry or that sort of field deal with that sort of thing, not blurring the lines of saying we've got so many guards or Marines or whatever on here that we can be classed as a military type vessel, but also like how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the whole system is built on a system of trust.
Yeah.
There's no, I mean, you could have a law in the book saying like, don't shoot at a merchant vessel,
So there
but
isn't one. Well, I guess what I'm saying is like these groups are not pirates or like yeah, okay, I'm gonna trust all the pirates. Like this doesn't really work.
well, and pirates aren't governments,
Yeah.
they're thieves. They're, people that belong to a state, but they're not acting out for the state. And so that gets back into the conversation of non-state actors and, how organized are pirates, who knows? I mean, and that also creates the Houthis are a different dynamic where they claim to be a government, but nobody recognizes them. And you know, I, I don't know, but they operate kind of like pirates as well, except their goal isn't to really take wealth from the vessels. They're there to just terrorize,
Hmm.
essentially. But yeah, and if we were in a major war, the easiest way to really strike at any forces is cut their supply chains off. I think Ulysses
Exactly.
S. Grant, he knew that in the Civil War, being a logistics officer as a junior officer, and he said the way to win war is through logistics. So
Yeah. So when when you're at work at your job or whatever, and you're like, oh, we've got a real problem with these pirates off here, or we've got a real problem with this situation. How much is it like we're gonna shift the route, or how much is it we're gonna add like a detachment of Marines or whatever, or whatever the case may be, is like how do you deal with the like the security piece of like, yeah, going through this particular passage of water tends to be more dangerous than others, and we do this to deal with it, and also we know that this particular passage is more dangerous because of XYZ things, right? Some so like what is that conversation like as you kind of like being the maritime policy guy?
Yeah.
Like what does that look like?
So I'm going to give you a very unsexy answer because
Sure.
I don't have the red button to just, fix it all. But it's really engaging with the stakeholders. The first thing I would do is make sure that we're communicating with companies, saying, hey, we're seeing an uptick in piracy in this area, or the Red Sea is dangerous for your ships to go through. And we have DOT's, maritime alert and advisory system where we can push out that kind of messaging. And the, maritime stakeholders and trade and news, they'll say, oh, the U.S. has just stated that this area is dangerous. So a lot of people keep their eyes on this kind of messaging, but it's up to the companies to ultimately make their decisions. Um, and for example, with the Red Sea right now, the big companies are not going through the Red Sea, even though it would be the quickest way to get to the markets like Europe and the United States. Um, and they don't do it because it's not safe for their seafarers on board and their business bottom line, because they have the asset of the vessel, they have the cargo, which the owners are the cargo owners are relying on these shipping companies to get their goods to the end destination, so there's a lot of money wrapped up into it. But in the meantime, with the Red Sea situation, um, they're going to go around Africa. They're going to expend more fuel and operating costs because you have to pay the crew members for that additional 2 weeks of transit. And ultimately, the container cost from going from China to Rotterdam is going to go up. Um, but some have argued that some of these companies are taking advantage of that by increasing it. And for example, the CEO of Maersk said in their annual statement at the beginning of the year that the difference between them making a $5 million profit and making just like breaking even is whether the Red Sea opens back up either mid-year or at the end of the year. So if the Red Sea were to open this summer, um, and they would resume routes up through the Red Sea, and shorten the voyages, then they would break even for the year. But if they continue to go around Africa till the end of the year, they can make a $5 million profit as a shipping company.
Mm.
So
That becomes interesting then for U.S. foreign policy in terms of like what constitutes like what does the U.S. determine that it needs to act on aggression towards American shipping? Does that get dicey? Where
yeah,
like if
so
you have a company that says like, you know what, we're gonna go through the Red Sea to save time and money, and we're gonna hire some private military contractors or security or whatever, but then they still get bombed by whoever. Like they took the risk to do so, but at the same time, like what constitutes, and this is the thing where it gets weird with companies that are like these multinational giant corporations where it's like, are they really US companies anymore? Like what respond like you know what I mean?
yeah. So yeah, it becomes a very interesting dynamic. I think we recently wrapped up, well, I don't know if it's officially wrapped up, but Operation Rough Rider, where we just bombed the hell out of the Houthis, and kind of we're trying to put them in a corner so we could resume shipping. And so President Trump came out a couple weeks ago saying, I reached a deal with the Houthis. Red Sea's open for operations. But then there were some like Houthi officials that were like, no, that's not true and whatnot. So there's this like mixed messaging, and shipping companies aren't going to go there because at the end of the day, they're taking a gamble,
Hmm.
and when there's a profit, incentive to not go through the Red Sea, like why change it up? Now you have CMA CGM, which is another one of those big container companies. It's a French flagged, well, not French flagged, a French owned company. And there's French forces in the Red Sea, and they do escort operations for this company because it gives them a comparative advantage to shorten that route and be more competitive in the scheme of container shipping because people are getting their cargo earlier and cheaper. And I wouldn't say that they've benefited so much as a result of this, but they do have that relief valve. But you're expending, missiles and whatnot to defend these ships. There's a cost at the end of the day for
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
If you were to look at dollars and cents, and then you have the issue of like, okay, the U.S. Navy is there, but we don't have ships to really support that trade. So we go back to the issue of like, what's the problem with not having ships? And this is the problem: is like we're working hard to open this trade lane, but European or Asian companies are like, ah, no, we're not going to do it. Whereas, not saying that we would direct private companies to say like, okay, it's safe, but we could offer escort abilities. In the 1980s, when Iran was attacking tankers in the Arabian Sea, they what the Reagan administration did was they reflagged these tankers to U.S. flag to justify why the Navy should defend them. So if the Iranians actually hit a U.S. flag tanker, that would be cause for war. So the
Mm.
Iranians didn't touch it. But
Yeah.
that same scheme really isn't working for the Red Sea, and it
Well,
hasn't.
no, because they're not real. They're just a group that is, well, whatever.
Yeah,
Um, Okay, so let's move on to the other sea that's named after a color. And the bullet says Shadow Fleet, which sounds super cool. So I've like I have not heard of it. I don't know what any of these things really are. So I'm just gonna let you go off these and kind of inform the viewers and listeners like what's going on with Russia. I would guess that it's related to the Ukraine conflict as well. So if you want to just talk to that and kind of what's going on and what people should know, maybe, or need to know, or if they want to be kind of informed, well, just
yeah.
open-ended.
Yeah, so Shadow Fleet, it's actually not so specific to Russia, but it's expanded because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I'll explain that in a second. But a Shadow Fleet, or some people call it a dark fleet, there's different terms for it. Nobody's settled on one, but it's the idea that in sanctioned oil trade or any kind of sanctioned activity on a ship, there are vessels out there that go to kind of an extreme flag of convenience and and operate in a way that they move sanctioned goods between point A and point B to avoid getting cut off. So let's talk about Iran and Venezuela, where we have a heavy sanctions campaign on them, especially on their oil. And so, by all means, you would think that there's no oil trade happening between Iran and any other country, but that's not true. They find ways to get ships, flag them in these, you know, extreme flags of convenience, and they move oil. They'll sometimes capture it by doing what we call ship to ship transfers in the middle of the sea, where like two ships come alongside and they'll transfer like Iranian oil onto another tanker, and then it will go off to the market. And they think they're being deceptive, but now we have like satellite imageries, automatic identification systems, radar that can really spot these vessels doing this murky activity just in order to continue that black market trade in a way. So the reason why I put this under the Russia category is we've seen the shadow fleet really blow up and bifurcate the tanker market because these kind of cheap assets of tankers that are like 30, 40 years old beyond the operating life of the tanker go into the shadow fleet and they move Russian crude oil from Russia to likely India or China as their final market. And we had the oil price cap come out in I think it was 2023, and we didn't completely cut off oil, but we said you can't sell it above this price point and whatnot. And but they still found ways to sell it above the price
Hmm.
point. And so the issue with the shadow fleet, though, is again it goes back to this very old vessel that at any time I don't know, could break in half or it could leak. And you can have like an Exxon Valdez kind of scenario in some coastal water where like a whole environmental ecosystem can be knocked out as a result. Also, it's just very unsafe for the mariners working on board. I mean, I'm conflicted because these mariners know that they're working in kind of a shadowy, murky market, but at the same time, they're trying to make their wages as well. They're coming from places like the Philippines or India or whatnot, and they're beholden to what the shipping company tells them to do. But there was an example of the motor tanker Pablo blew up off the coast of Indonesia, I believe in 2023. And essentially, they were a shadow fleet tanker. And because of the fact that they weren't using legitimate, um, or they didn't have legitimate, insurance or regulation or whatnot, it exploded, killing some of the mariners on board. You know, if it wasn't for the unsatisfactory conditions of the vessel, which was a result of the shipping company, kind of hiding in the shadows, these mariners would have probably still been living.
These are not ours, though. So, like, there's crappy working conditions everywhere.
Yeah.
No, like, I get the concern and and what you're saying, but also like we still manufacture iPhones in China where there's nets on the side of the building so people don't jump off. Although I guess they moved that recently. But it like so okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that
But
that
but
was a thing.
the real concern for the Americans is this is sanctions,
Yeah.
goods moving, and that's at the end of the day for Americans, that's the big prerogative there is to cut off that trade.
Yeah, it feels like not just with this, but with other things, like you look at like drug trade and other various forms of sanctioned or illegal activities, there's always a market there and it creates opportunities for people that don't care about rules and laws and things of that nature. And it's like I mean, that's kind of a broader philosophical question. But the last point that you mentioned on the future of shipping, the autonomous shipping, the energy diversification, and the Arctic specifically, those three are super interesting to me, just from the standpoint of like both the Arctic and then also kind of Antarctica, which is like less, it's got a little bit of lore to it, right? There's always people going down there saying that there's UFOs flying out of holes in the ground and all these things. Um, and then the energy diversification, there's like this whole related thing of um, putting the tinfoil hat on, right? People talk about ancient civilizations, UFOs, energy diversification, Arctic and Antarctic and all these different things. And it feels like all these things are very intriguing, but also there's kernels of truth to a lot of them, right? We talk about um, how energy can be cheaper, so it's accessible to the world, and energy prices being the main driver for a lot of different policies and things that are going on. Um, Increases in scientific technology means that you don't have to have humans. be on the ship, and therefore you don't have to build the ships with a chow hall and bathrooms and bunks, and so you save space and weight and fuel because there's less weight on it and all these things. Like, so I guess just talk to, because to me, all those things are really, and then from the Arctic perspective, if you don't have humans on, then you're not really as worried about the temperature conditions for the humans. And so all these things are, to me, related, um, even taking the tinfoil hat off. But talk to some of these things, just like I guess if you had specific things for each one of those bullets, like feel free to go off those as well. But for me, they're all related, and so I just wanted to hear your thoughts on those as well.
Yeah, no, I'd definitely be interested to hear how you might see them as related. I did want to take the opportunity to touch on what the future of shipping looks like. And right now there's a lot of discussion on autonomous shipping or unmanned shipping. There's a little bit of talk on the commercial side of it, but it's very prevalent in, warships and whatnot. U.S. Navy is spending a lot of money on research and development there. It's been utilized by the Houthis actually, where they're basically kind of have these drone boats loaded with bombs to hit the tankers. And then drone warfare in the Ukraine-Russia conflict has just been huge. So there's like many sectors, the US military is likely going to lead in research and development there, and it will eventually trickle down to private sector. Um, but it creates an interesting dynamic because if you can make a ship autonomous, a private company would love it. You'd reduce operating costs, you'd be more competitive in a lot of ways, and then you don't have to worry too much about human error and everything. I mean, there's still going to be human error baked into it, but um, you know, not as much. And so and then also communication between ships. If so, I'm also a Navy reservist that works on what we call naval cooperation and guidance for shipping. So, when there is an unsafe condition for a commercial ship, we are like the Navy conduit that speaks to both sides. So we can, brief a commander on what we're seeing in what we call the white shipping picture, but we can also have a conversation with commercial companies saying like, hey, you're operating in a dangerous area. Is there a way you can move out of this area and whatnot? But what happens then if you're an autonomous ship that's minimally manned instead of like a crew of 20 people on board? Maybe it's like two people that work as like technicians, or maybe there's nobody on board. How do you interact with that kind of a vessel and
Hmm.
and to move them in different ways? And I think we'll definitely have to get creative on that front for sure. Energy diversification. Um, I mean, we're only going to need more energy moving forward because as our economies continue to advance, there's just more demand for energy. And so um, we petroleum is a great source, and it's going to continue to drive the maritime transportation sector. But it's not a bad idea to look at the other sectors as well, because if it's possible to scale up one energy source and potentially reduce the cost, um, that would be great. But there's a lot of money going into research and development right now. The International Maritime Organization has kind of set some guidelines for a 2050 kind of net zero um, approach to fueling ships and whatnot. Um, we'll see where that goes. It's going to be difficult because again, it's a lot of R&D money. There's going to be winners and losers, and we'll have to figure that out. But the Arctic also, kind of capping off here there's a lot of interest, especially in the Trump administration, to be more present in those areas. We have uh, two and a half icebreakers in our fleet, in our Coast Guard fleet, and one of them's like in disrepair. I think that was in a collision or something recently. But if
Oh, good.
it, yeah, but I mean, Russia in the meantime, they're opening up this new trade route north. I mean, it's not big. They've been moving a few ships a year through it, but it could reduce the transit times from going from Asia to Europe. And meanwhile, over the U.S. and Canada, we don't really have a trade lane open, and then look at Greenland too. The whole, I'd call it a kerfuffle with Greenland. It's about critical resources, but it's also about having presence in the Arctic region. So, a lot more to come on that. I actually work on a trilateral group called the Icebreaker Collaboration Effort between Finland, Canada, and the US. And this goes back to our lack of shipbuilding capacity, but we want to work with like Finland, who can crank out about 12 icebreakers in their shipyards a year. Canada can crank out two a year, and we're at like half a ship a year for icebreakers. And so if as we wanted to, ramp up our production in the United States, we need to work with our partners and allies to improve the workforce development and also do technological information exchange.
Yeah, makes sense. Is there anything else that you wanna touch on?
Um, I think another area that is kind of still flying under the radar, but is undersea cable sabotage.
Mm.
Um, and we're seeing this a lot in the Baltic Sea. So on Christmas of last year, there was this vessel called the Eagle S who was at anchor, very normal operation, but then all of a sudden they just start drifting and power goes out in Finland because there's this big power cable under the sea connecting Estonia and Finland. This vessel was going miles dragging its anchor. And if you're an operator on the vessel, like if you're dragging your anchor, you need to do something to make sure to stop because you need to maintain place. But this vessel just kept on going, and so there was a lot of discussion that they were purposely sabotaging, the electrical cables and potentially gas cables or gas pipelines connecting the two countries for the benefit of Russia. And a lot of discussion on this being a shadow fleet vessel. So in that area, recently, Estonia and Finland have been increasing their military presence, and they were they were pulling some of these shadow fleet vessels, saying like, "Hey, whatever you're doing is not okay. We're going to investigate you." And then I think it was a couple of weeks ago, Russian military fighters went to escort these commercial kind of like shadow fleet vessels. So it's definitely an escalation that you should keep your eye on in the coming weeks. But it's for the Baltic countries. This is very high priority and concerning action.
Yeah, I can see I can see why. Uh, is there a place or a resource or website that people can go to learn more or to kind of if they've got questions other than Google or not really?
Yeah, I mean, some of the news sources that I follow, at least from maritime trade and economics, are going to be Splash 24/7, Maritime Executive, G Captain's another one. And there's also a podcaster named Sal Mercarigliano. His podcast is called "What's Going On with Shipping," and he does, kind of weekly updates on shipping. So if you wanted to learn more, he's a good resource.
Gotcha. Any last nickels before we get you out of here?
No, no, I think this was a good discussion. I'm glad it kind of flowed organically, but yeah, I hope you and your listeners have taken away some things.
Yeah, definitely learned a lot. It's definitely a foreign world to me, but definitely appreciate having you on. And if you guys want to learn more, because it's not Ryan stuff, I'm not really gonna put the links in the description as usual. But like, go check it out if you're interested in learning more. If you have other questions, of course, you can put it in the comments or whatever, and I can text Ryan get an answer for you. Um, but thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you guys next time. Peace. Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.